All right, I'm going to shut that recording.
Tracy.
Okay. So I'd like to welcome folks to this banned book panel discussion. We have David Zuckerman, our Lieutenant Governor, is here. Beth Shelley is a librarian at A.D. Lawton Intermediate School.
Actually, that's Caitlin.
I'm sorry, I got them backwards, sorry. And Caitlin is at A.D. Lawton.
Correct.
And Beth is at Westford.
Yep.
Okay, and I also wanted to say that they are both co-reps for intellectual freedom for the Vermont School Library Association. Thank you all for being here.
And you are.
And I'm Kara Millet. I'm the Vice President for Vermont Council on Literacy and the conference chair.
And I guess I will be quasi-moderating. I've been hosting actually readings of banned books and talking about the importance of critical thinking, of access to information, of ways that book banning has led to some historical political changes in different parts of the world. For the last, about a year now. In fact, I hosted one in this very room that had about 20, 25 people in it. And look forward to the discussion of what is reading all about? What is information all about? What is diverse opinions, diverse literature? What are the values of that in a broadly diverse society? And seeing where the conversation goes, both with our readers, our librarians, who are certainly in some states taking the brunt of the discussion that's happening, and discussion is as pleasant a word as I can put it in some circumstances. And so I'm really ready to turn over to hear your thoughts as librarians and why you're reading what you're reading. And then what we did in the past was maybe 5 or 8 minutes each doing our individual pieces, and then open it up to people who are watching, people that are here, and seeing where the conversation goes. So you go ahead.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. Then we hit a little button that needs to be on the screen. That's gonna drive me crazy.
Do we want to jump in with the books that we brought, or do we want to start with?
Start a little bit with, as a librarian, what is it that you do?
Yeah.
Right? Because sometimes people don't realize, and sometimes in these conversations I've had people question, and I say, well, the librarians decide what's in the library, whether it's a public library or a school library, but also I believe you're trained to do your job. I believe you have a lot of input in how you do your job and in meeting the needs of both your teachers who might have books they want to assign, but also the breadth of material for the breadth of interest. And how do you decide out of the millions, if not billion books that are out there in a space that might only hold a couple thousand books, what you already do as your own books?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Well, I think, why don't we tag team it?
Yeah,
I feel like we
absolutely.
present on this a lot,
Oh,
so
good.
if it's okay, we'll just
Sure.
share. That's what we do.
Sure.
But that's a great question about, like, just bringing up the books we already have and the space limitations we have. If we had endless budgets, being a librarian would be so much fun, because you could just get everything you wanted in as many copies as you wanted. But right now, like, we are looking not only at the political and social atmosphere, where it feels very combative about book choices, but we are also looking at like budget reductions. And that makes it even harder because the cost of everything is always increasing. Like, books cost so much more than they did when my budget was built.
So inflation has happened to books as well as the rest of people
100%.
facing.
Yeah, and things like covering material and anything we need to like process those books to get them into the kids' hands. Everything is so much more expensive. So it's making those choices. Like you said, we are trained, we have master's degrees, we are licensed teachers by the state of Vermont to be, Beth and I are both public school librarians. And we have a selection policy that we've developed. We inherited one, and then we work in the Essex Westford School District, and we have a very strong library team, which is awesome. And we revisited our selection policy to make sure that we're providing things that not only support our curriculum, but support the needs and interests of our students outside of the curriculum. It's a good gig, but it's a lot. You have to meet a lot of interests and you're one human, so.
And we're constantly just balancing that cost with need and what is it that students are asking for and what is it that they want. And I can read all the reviews, I can go through school library journal, I can look at all the books that are recommended, and then I have to sit here and go, but is it going to circulate? Because what my kids are asking for are 10 more copies of Dog Man and Amulet and everything else. And this is great, I'm gonna get 2 copies of that, but I'm gonna get 8 of this. And then, and also just keeping up with the collection that you already have. We're taking in new books every year and we're weeding old ones as well. We're getting rid of books that have, that are damaged, that are worn, that are no longer serving our population, that maybe have information that's outdated and could in fact cause harm. Like we really need to be thoughtful about, books that have outdated language and, the way that we approach certain topics and the language that's being used is maybe not, supporting what we want students to be taking away from anymore. So it is a lot. It's so much more than just, if I just read all day, my job would be significantly more boring, but also like just so different than what people think that I do all day long. Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question that comes to mind from the conversations I've had around the state? It sounds like you've done some of these sorts of things yourself. I remember reading at some point about either a college professor or a teacher being removed from their job because they were reading from a history book that had the N-word in it, and the N-word was someone else's quote, and they were still subject to sanction, I believe, lost their job for, in some respects, I think, reflecting part of the very real history. And so as you're looking at language that causes harm, how do you balance the idea that it's also important to understand what happened?
Yeah.
And the language that has been used in different segments of our history that was common language, as painful as it was, that is becoming, it is not removed, but becoming less common as a part of education versus simply removing it or erasing it.
Right.
And I use the word erase delicately because I think it's a very different thing to take down a monument that was erected during Jim Crow to idolize a time of our past, which is not a historical educational material, but more of an idolatry versus truly sort of not ever uttering a word
Yeah.
that was a part of our past.
Right.
How do you balance that?
Books are a really safe place to explore and learn those topics. I had a couple of years ago, I was using the book, Becoming Kareem, as a book club book, which is a wonderful book about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It's his memoir. He talks about his life growing up playing basketball, and he had a coach who motivated him by calling him the N-word. That is the opposite of motivation. That is demeaning, that is demoralizing, that is, stripping away someone's humanity. And he uses the word in the book. And I had a conversation with my middle schoolers ahead of time and said, this word, I didn't say it, but there is this word that is going to appear in the book. We will refer to this word as the N-word. We will never say this book. This was a fully class of all white people. We cannot say this word. It belongs to a group of people for whom it means a very different thing, who can reclaim that language, who can use it in whatever way they choose to. We cannot, because from someone who looks like me, this word has only ever been used to cause harm, and we cannot say it. And I had a couple of kids come up to me afterwards and say, oh my gosh, Miss Shelley, I don't know what the N-word is. What if I accidentally say it? And they were terrified because I had really driven home this point that we don't say this, we never can. And I flipped open to the page and I showed them, and it happened to be italicized. And I was like, the very font choice that was used carries power, shows us how immense this word is. And there they saw it, and it was and I obviously contacted the parents right away so that it wasn't like, I learned the N-word at school today from Miss Shelley. This was the conversation we had, this is what we talked about. And what a safe place to learn that word than seeing it scrawled into the seat in the bus, carved into the upholstery, or written on, a sign somewhere, or shouted at somebody. This is a safe place. Books are always a safe place. We just have to be thoughtful. We have a lot of power too in the books that we choose to share and the books that we read aloud and the passages that we read aloud. And so we just have to be thoughtful and aware of that going into it, that I don't know what the context was. I don't know who was in the room.
Right.
It could have been harmful to someone, and we just have to be aware of that.
So that's interesting, because I have not heard of that absolute a expression of whether the word can be used or not, because in an educational setting, I suppose I would think if it was quoting someone else's words
Yeah,
with that educational envelope, that would be a rare instance, but
Right.
that one could use it to explain it as a tool of, that it is a tool of art. We talk about, knives or guns, and those things are sometimes used to cause physical harm,
exactly.
but we do use the language.
They also have a purpose.
Yeah.
Sure, and that word in its time, we may find it abhorrent purpose,
Yeah.
but it had a purpose.
Yeah,
But
it's
that's
definitely
interesting.
its own form of censorship, whether we choose to say those words or not, and I'm always going to be on the side of,
Sure,
we just don't.
right, and you educate why, and then of course the student over time can choose.
Right, well, hopefully,
What
like, we
their
planted those
balance might
seeds,
be.
and hopefully that becomes something that is, you know, an agent of change, we don't know.
It sticks with them.
Yeah.
And that's one of the benefits of being teachers as well, is we're able to scaffold those conversations in thoughtful ways. We also know the materials we're teaching, so we're able to share with them ahead of time, like, here are some of our norms for when we talk about these things, and we set those guidelines early. And we try to adhere to them and hold each other accountable to them, because children are children, they don't know, and it's helpful to phrase things and give them historical context of why things and why choices and language specifically were used in certain books. It's interesting too, because one of the most popular books in my school is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which has a lot of strong language in it. And my students respond so well to that book because it ignites like a social justice fire inside them. And they're like, these things are still happening. That book is not historical fiction. Like, that is a modern day story. And it's such a great teaching tool as well.
And how do you address the question, and you're welcome to chime in too, and I don't know exactly I apologize, getting you right at the cusp, I didn't learn as much about each of you as I should know. How do you address the concern of some who say, how we're teaching this is a form of indoctrination to a way of thinking versus an educational tool about harms that certain language has caused, and language that you may want to reconsider using or not use at all.
Right.
How do you, as a public educator, that has potentially a range of perspectives of families and parents and so forth, how do you answer that question of what is quote indoctrination versus education?
I think that's like an inflammatory buzzword right now, indoctrinate. If I could indoctrinate the kids to charge their Chromebooks before school, I would do that. Like, if we could indoctrinate them to raise their hand and not just blurt out in the middle of class, like, that would be cool. But in terms of indoctrinating kids, we are public school educators. We are beholden to the taxpayers of our district, to the students that we serve and our colleagues, that we are teaching full portraits of American history, that the kids are not being too sheltered from what's happening in the world today, because let's not forget that our kids are more connected than ever with social media. They know things beyond what, I mean, honestly, I hate the word appropriate, but I'm in a middle school. I'm in grades 6 through 8. The stuff that my kids are exposed to on their own through their phones and their games, like, I would much rather have a conversation with someone who thinks we're indoctrinating kids to be like, if you actually look at our curriculum and you see how it aligns with state standards and you see the work we're doing, trying to grow their hearts and minds as students, like, my goal with our students is they become critical thinkers and kind people, that we're building their empathy as well as their knowledge. And when people say we're indoctrinating students, I don't think they understand public education.
Yeah. For sure, and I think that along the lines of indoctrination also implies this like shadowy, you know, like secretive stuff going on behind closed doors. Our curriculum is forward facing, our catalogs are publicly searchable. You wanna know what books I have at it, like nothing is happening behind closed doors. And I think that the indoctrination kind of buzzword and that whole fear came around during the pandemic when our schools were closed and we weren't able to like welcome parents in the same way that we were. And I know that in my school, we stopped having volunteers, we stopped, you know, and it did feel like all of a sudden, like, well, what's sense we have our cars. And it really, like, it just, the whole moment in our history, really, it was interesting to see what was happening beyond just schools at that moment. And it all, you know, definitely connects back together.
Can Do you have thoughts as a teacher or a retired
Well,
teacher that?
um,
on some of this?
Yeah, I am a retired teacher. I wanted to organize this conversation because I just think it's so very important. And, wanted to have it through Zoom so that teachers from other parts of the state could be here virtually. Welcome. I want to ask each of you, what's the biggest piece of advice or what's your biggest concern about this topic? So I don't know who wants to go first.
It's a big,
The topic of book banning in general?
Yeah, the topic of book banning in general. So your concern or advice?
I guess for me, the concern is someone who's in public office and thinks about democracy and how democracy is supposed to work with people, being fully allowed their own opinions across whatever spectrum. Everyone has a full right to their opinion, whether I think it's exactly in alignment with me, or whether it's abhorrent to me, or it's a complex set of, sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. That's everyone's right to their opinion. But two aspects make me very nervous. One is when someone says, that book shouldn't be in school, period, or shouldn't be available for certain people to have access to. That is trying to control access for other people to have information. One has every right with their own children to say, thank you for teaching, can you find a different book? Or at least I think to the age of 16, and then maybe they don't quite have as much control. But to say, thank you very much, can you not use that book for anything in the school, is a very different limitation with respect to the broad spectrum and concept of critical thinking. The second piece of that, and I alluded to it when I started talking, has to do more with governance in general, democracy in general, and movements that, in some aspects, I think are very much at a very scary moment in our democracy towards a more authoritarian form of governance, which, when you have someone, for instance, and I'll be limiting my political commentary, but who says, we'll lock all of those people up, whoever those people are, for simply expressing a different viewpoint. That, I don't care what the viewpoint is not a quote, law and order or equal rights mindset, which is the foundation of our democracy. I sometimes put it out there, we're in a state that has some of the most liberal gun laws in the country. And I have mixed, but mostly okay feelings about that. And there's maybe a few parameters we could continue to consider. But what if the majority, because by a majority rule authoritarian mindset, one could say, well, if the majority of folks say guns represent violence and harm, so kids shouldn't be exposed to any books that have guns in them. Sort of hinted at that earlier, because that's just something that is inherently a harmful thing. What if the majority thought that? I would think some of the people in some of the states that are concerned about maybe different material, whether it's Tango Makes Three, which is a book that I brought, which has no sexually explicit references at all, but has two male penguins rearing a baby penguin, real story from New York Zoo. They might say, I don't want that in schools. In fact, it has been challenged and banned. And yet, well, what if the shoe is on a different foot? What if people said no guns in any books, no history, no nothing about violence, period? I think that would upset a different group. And the concept is none of these things should be banned because we need exposure and learning about all of these different topics.
Yeah.
So that to me are some of the things.
My biggest concern around this topic, when I just think really small about my own school in Westford, which is a blink and you'll miss a little, tiny little town on the way from Essex to Fairfax or St. Albans. My kids, we have 225 kids in my school. They're pre-K 8. They all know each other. They're all together from the time that they're very small until they're, going off to high school. And some of them will never leave the town of Westford or the town of Essex or Chittenden County. They will know this small little snow globe of Vermont, which, does not represent a whole lot of racial diversity or other forms of diversity. And I'm so afraid of them growing up thinking that this little homogenous community reflects the greater world, and it does not. And at some point, they will leave this sheltered little snow globe and they will find themselves with people who don't look like them, with ideas that challenge them, things that they've never been exposed to because those ideas have been taken away from them, those books that represent different ideas and opinions and, people, all of a sudden they will find themselves afraid and not knowing how to grapple with these ideas. And that is terrifying. Books are such a safe place to explore any number of new ideas. And to take that away from a child is, just unthinkable for me.
Well, we love Rudine Sims Bishop. She has a
Yes, we
quote
do.
where books can function as windows or mirrors or sliding glass doors. So we teach our students that language and we talk about window books, like you experience someone else's life. You get to look through that window into this other world. A mirror book can reflect your own experiences back to you. And then a sliding glass door book is both of those things at once. And when you have students in your school who are new Americans or recently come out and they're part of the LGBTQ+ community and they are looking for some kind of identity, books give kids the ability to be like, oh, me too. They let you feel like you are not alone. And that is so important, especially like, again, I teach middle school, like a fragile age. It's the messy middle part of growing up. And being able to find connection in literature lets kids feel like they are not alone and they also deserve a place on the page. And good librarians know that there is room for everyone's story on the shelf. One of my big concerns is when people talk about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, right? We teach our kids that, like, freedom of speech applies to text. You have the choice to read that. Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences. And I think that's something important that people tend to forget, that yes, you have the right to say that, but we also live in societies where you could be causing harm and you can yell, it's my freedom of speech all day. That's fine, it is. But that does not mean there's no consequence that comes with what you say.
And again, we're in kind of a climactic moment around that as well, from a
Yeah,
broader political perspective.
Yeah.
right.
Sorry,
And freedom of
interject.
speech is something we want to protect, like I want people to have that, but not when it does harm.
Yeah.
But that's one of those consequences that we have to talk to the kids about. So, another thing I worry about is librarians. We talk a lot about like soft censorship,
Yeah.
like being concerned, like I don't want to put myself at risk, my job at risk.
Mhm.
By selecting this book for my library, people who are hesitating to put up displays featuring authors of color or queer authors because they're worried about like what community members will say. Strong communities are diverse communities. Strong communities take all kinds of people. And I think I worry about librarians fearing repercussions, especially like some people have lost their jobs
Oh.
about what books they've chosen to include or not in a library. And I just think that's really wild. And I also feel strongly that if people would like to challenge a book, again, you can decide for your child, you are the parent, you are the guardian. Like, of course, we are a team. First and foremost, we're on the same team. We both want what's best for your kid. And if you choose that your child does not read that material, that's your choice as a parent, 100%. But you don't get to make that choice for everyone else's kids. And that's where things can get a little dicey, because I think people also feel a lot of fear in today's world. And this is something that they feel like they can control, when I would love to just know that my kids were reading books and weren't Googling things in the deep dark pit of the internet,
Right.
unsupervised.
In some states, can people not only lose their job, potentially be put in jail?
Yes,
I just want to make
I
that.
think there's legislation. I don't know if but there's legislation.
Yeah, it's
in
definitely been
force.
introduced in many states. I don't know that it's gone as far as,
Actual.
Yeah. and we're really fortunate here in Vermont. We are a really liberal state. We have many of our schools currently have strong and robust policies and procedures in place, and we have legislation moving forward to make that required, which hopefully becomes a thing very soon. In our district, we feel really supported by our administration and from each other. We have a really strong network of librarians, but we as intellectual freedom representatives have counseled a lot of librarians through some messy challenges where there has been nothing in place, no roadmap, not even this is how I can at least fall back on a policy, or I can show this procedure for this is how I've selected this book. And in that moment, when you have a concerned parent or an angry patron, it feels like your integrity and your professionalism is being attacked and questioned in a way that is, even if you don't stay on the risk of losing your job, that rattles you, and that is hard to deal with. And so you asked about advice, and the advice that we always give is just within this community of, literate readers, whatever, beyond schools, beyond libraries. I mean, look at what you've arranged today. Like, this is a community that cares about this topic. and how fortunate we are to be able to lean on those many resources and know that even if you, do find yourself in this position, there are so many people that will be right there standing behind you and, supporting you through it. We've done it
Many times.
and it's not a fun email to open up, but then there is also that like, yeah, let's go,
And the piece of advice, because I've had, I wish more of the meetings that I've done around the state had a more diverse group attending, because I really wanted it to be a community conversation about what is this
Mhm.
topic? Not what is that book about or this book about, but we can do that, but more like what is the broader topic? And there have been a few with some people who have been raised some different concerns.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important for those that are on the liberal end of the spectrum,
Sure.
which does not always mean left politics. The word liberal and conservative is also about sort of open and constrained.
Mhm.
It's not always politically left and right. And I think sometimes the words, they lose their multiple meanings,
Sure.
and often words in a dictionary have actually multiple meanings. But often when people say, well, what about, and there's a book that comes up a lot, genderqueer, and a graphic novel. And they say, well, what about the depictions in that book that's traumatizing for some? And I said, well, first of all, some people say, kindergartners are gonna get in that book. And I said, I don't know where you're getting your information, but feel free to tell, or teacher is using that for kindergarten, because I don't really think that's an issue in Vermont. I think librarians and educators are trained to, and you mentioned the word age appropriate, to use the right books at the right time based on the mental development, because not everybody has the same mental development at the exact same grade, which is another thing where you draw firm lines that aren't really accurate at all. But I point out, and you mentioned earlier, that what kids, ask me, does your kid have a cell phone or computer access? Because what they can access on here around gender issues in particular, or coming of age, is far less contextual than the books. And if you read a little bit of context in gender queer, you'll understand what's going on with respect to a person's individual experience. It's a memoir. Things they were made to do or pressured to do, and they were trying to teach how that's probably not a good thing and not appropriate, which a kid could learn a lot from, to say, oh, if I'm forced to do these things, I should tell somebody, this is not okay.
Right.
But in the context of when they see sexually explicit material on a screen, there is no context. And at one of the meetings, there was a person who was a lawyer saying, in fact, there is a definition of pornography. And pornography has no educational or redeeming quality. And so when they say there's pornography and gender queer, that's actually not true.
Right.
Because it is an educational piece with context versus what is seen on the screen that they have likely given their child in fourth, fifth, or sixth grade. So it's good to have that conversation, and not to say you are wrong, or you have no right to ask that your kid doesn't see a particular book. Any person has that right. But be aware that the educational context is really important versus no context.
Right.
From an
And
advice perspective.
we use taxpayer money to buy our material, which is why we have a selection policy, which means that we vet the books we buy. Like Betsy, we only have so much money. If I have endless money, oh my God, it'd be unstoppable. So with genderqueer in particular, like also well reviewed, it was available in our case, we had a challenge against genderqueer a couple years ago. One copy available in our high school, the resources that resources we used to look at reviews had said 16 and up. 16 is in high school. And we also do not judge material based on one image, one word, one sentence. We look at material as a whole. And that's something we teach our students to do as well. And the big stir about genderqueer being available to kids, no 5-year-old, one, is gonna be interested in that, and two, would be able to stick with it.
Yeah.
Like, that's the other side of it, like, no kid's gonna, 5-year-old's gonna be like, I can't read that, like, they're not gonna care. And that book, none of my students had heard of it, no one cared about it until someone decided to go and get it and isolate certain images and phrases from that book, which then made it like an illegal thing, forbidden fruit. Now they're like, can I have it? Can I get it? Can I read it? Now I'm like, well, that's people who try to ban books. You did the exact opposite thing we meant to. Because if you were like, I'm gonna keep kids safe by not giving them this, you cannot make them more interested in anything than if you say, you cannot have this.
Right.
Hmm.
The one copy that the high school had then turned into 8 because we had to purchase a copy for all of our librarians to read. Because that is what our selection procedure says, or our request for reconsideration procedure says we need to do. So now we all have to read it, so we need multiple copies, and now, we
Yeah.
have more that we then donated, because again, we all looked at it and it was, yes, it serves its purpose in this school and it fits within this policy and it, meets this need. It does not meet my need, not my K-8 need. It does not meet your 6-8 need. It certainly does not meet the K-2 need.
No.
So all of those copies that we bought, we donated to our local libraries, or they stayed in the high school because now all of a sudden there was a lot more demand for it.
Yeah, now there was a whole list a mile long, because then those kids have heard that there was a book that they weren't supposed to have,
Right.
and they had to see it immediately.
But the problem that, some librarians are running into is because they don't have the policies in
Yes.
place. So that's where you can step in and help.
Yep.
Yeah.
We worked really hard as Vermont School Librarians, our VCL organization, 2 years ago, wrote a model policy, which was then adopted by the Vermont School Boards Association as a recommended policy. It's not yet required. We are hoping, and there's legislation that has been introduced to make it required for school libraries and also just in general for instructional materials for what teachers choose to read aloud, that there is a procedure that shows this is why we've chosen it. It's not just somebody pushing their agenda saying, everyone's gonna read this book because I want to. There
Does the
is,
ALA or Penn American Library Association or Penn America also have model review language that you know of?
the ALA has the freedom to read statement, and they, ALA and AASL have like a whole toolkit for, if you wanna write a policy, here's some things to include, and we fall back on that. Our procedure quotes the ALA freedom to read statement. It's like the first thing.
Question?
Well, if I could comment, I'm Kristen, I'm the director of this library. Thanks for coming here, thanks for having us here, yeah, it's great, I'm glad I came down. I wanted to, if I could, comment on something that I'm fearful of. And that is, and I think it echoes what you have said, and it's this idea of the policies and the procedures, the governance, and how I think we have to be vigilant about who's on our boards and who's on our school committees, and volunteer our time and keep our eyes on that, because that sort of infiltration, I think your question is what scares you? That scares me. If we lose that ground, those organizations, those political bodies should be our allies. They should understand as well as you do, the freedom to read and what we're talking about here. And when they don't, or they do, but they come in with their own agenda, that's dangerous. And so I think it's easy for people to see it at the federal level or the national level. But really, we're talking about school committees and public library boards and trustees. And we need to make sure that those are allies when those opening seats come up.
Well, I've been asked sometimes, why did you do this tour all over the state? There's been no successful challenges in Vermont. And there's a couple different things. You've talked about the self-censorship that's now a fear that's in librarians all over the country, is potentially, you really want to stir up a hornet's nest, or you just maybe don't pick a book because of that, and each of you knows your own personal limits of what you've done or not in that regard. But also, in the communities I've had this conversation where we've gone into some of these questions a little bit more depth of how it really works and what librarians do. That has helped, I think, a lot of folks who have come to the meetings be prepared. So that if this conversation comes up in their community with a candidate for the school board or the library trustees, and it becomes a debate in the community, they're well resourced, having seen and heard this conversation about how does it really work? Because most people don't know. I didn't really know, I'm still learning even after many of these. So more information from you all. And also what those parameters are in terms of parental rights, 16 and over versus under, or you do have a right around what your kid learns versus other kids. And we've had, and I think Essex is one of the towns where some folks have run for school board that have had an agenda that includes some constraining parameters. And so far in Vermont, wherever the woods might be, in my opinion, they've not won, because the community has rallied and had that conversation, which, I think is a nice testament to citizen participation and knowledge, and back to our scale of communities, where I think we're fortunate, we don't get sort of all of our ideas from forms of media, but actually these community
Do you
conversations.
want to speak to the policy versus procedure?
I was going.
Yes, I
Great.
do. You like feel like that we don't have to.
Yes, please.
So Beth and I were raised since we were baby librarians, that we always want to have capital P policies on file. Policy is what you want.
Right.
From grad school through my first 9 years.
The
of
sunrise
librarianship.
is also policy.
Policies. But then I had a conversation with one of the admins in our district where we talked about policy is controlled by school boards. Procedures are controlled by us. So we've been adopting procedures because that's something that the district can control, and a policy is something a school board can control. So if you have a school board where you've seen a title shift in values about some people pushing their own agenda and thinking about themselves and not what is best for the kids we are teaching, because at the end of the day, the people we are beholden to are our students, all of them. We are public school educators. We welcome everyone. People lose sight of that when they're pushing their own agenda. And so there is a difference between like having procedures in place, but again, librarian jobs in the state of Vermont are getting lost. People are working without assistance. I have a full-time assistant. I can barely breathe during my school day. Look, that has no assistant. And like, we're circulating 1,200 items a day. Like just circulation alone is a full-time job. And like, if you are alone, how are you supposed to then sit down and be like, how do I write a selection procedure? What am I gonna do? What kind of policies can I create for myself? So the Vermont School Librarian Association worked to make this model policy so people would have that as a template, because the best offense is a good defense. And also, it's sad that we have to think about it, that we're like prepping a defense, but like, this is the work we've been doing the whole time before book bannings became like the next hot buzzword to fight about. Like, we've been doing this work, and librarians and the work they do are so valuable in their schools, particularly rural public schools, where kids, like Beth had said, like get to see this tiny snow globe version of the world. That's not real life. And with library books, kids are given the ability to travel somewhere else and learn something new in a safe context with people there to support them. But policy and procedure, I don't care what you have in place, as long as you have something. You need to know what next steps, you need to know, because it's inevitable that you're going to get a challenge. That's life, it's going to happen. And again, we often talk about when you are challenged on material, if you feel like you are being personally attacked. Sometimes it's the case they're trying to hurt your feelings, but most of the time they're not trying to hurt your feelings. But we talk about, oh, I lost my train of thought about when people are challenging us.
And it feels like you're being, are you about to say your why?
My why?
About knowing your why? I feel like that was.
Do it, say it.
Okay, this is something that I want to steal from Caitlin because it's so powerful and it's so beautiful. And earlier when you talked about advice that you would give, I almost said it, but I was like, no, that's Caitlin's, I can't steal it, but now.
Take it.
A couple of years ago, when we were facing, I think it was another time we had spoken, about this topic, and we had just come off the heels of a pretty powerful challenge with our own district. It was about gender queer. And Caitlin said, it was just sort of about like, how do you keep doing this or showing up or whatever it was? And Caitlin was like, because I know my why. I don't know why I'm saying this with you right here, but I have to.
Clearly my why is not, so you can.
And she was like, because it feels like you're being attacked. It feels like someone is questioning every like cell of your being. And Caitlin, just said like, I know my why, I'm here for these kids. And that is, you can't rattle that out of me. You can't, that foundation I stand on is so strong. And I thought about that when a couple of years ago, and again, my school is overwhelmingly white. And we had a new student who came, and her family was Nepalese, and she had been in the school for a year. And she was looking through a book and she found, I gave her this one, I was like, oh, I think you might like this. And she came back the next day and she goes, this is the first time that I'm seeing myself in a book. And she was in 6th grade, and that was like unforgivable that, how has she gone so long? Like, I could walk anywhere and everything looks like me. I live in a hall of mirrors. And this kid was not seeing herself. And so just that why, like, I'm here for these kids. You can say whatever you want. You can say I'm indoctrinating kids. You can call me whatever. I am here for them at the end of the day. and to find the books that, I don't care, I mean, it's wonderful when they say like, oh my gosh, like I felt seen. And then other times they just come back and they're like, this book was so funny, I loved it, like those moments too, just like that is jet fuel for us. And it is so, just, you ride that constantly, they just, that's why we show up, these kids just are excited about books and,
It's good advice for politicians too, know your why, because
Know your why.
occasionally
Oh,
politicians get a little bit attracted at the stuff of other issues too. But even just doing this tour, and I don't know if you have had, either, you are a pedophile or you are a groomer thrown at you.
Oh, we did.
But on
We had
social
both.
media,
Yeah.
I get regular, charges of such things simply for talking about access to information. You know, it's an interesting, and again, I know my why and I know, I feel secure about myself, so they don't land that hard and I sort of actually feel,
I like that.
use the word at me, so you maybe use it one last time towards someone else for whom a whole, group of people has been called this and is far more harmful, as we said earlier with a different word. Throw it at me so that, maybe one last time goes to somebody else, so it diminishes the
Yeah.
value of the word, the
Yeah.
way you're misusing it.
But also there's so much good language in the world, like
Right.
maybe pick a more accurate word.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's hard, but yeah, we got that, we got.
Know your
someone
why.
who Told us, yeah, we got it,
I like that.
things that can't shape you.
yeah.
And like I tell my students all the time, like, there's like, honestly, probably 90% of stuff I just don't care about, but like certain things I really care, like their right to read what they would like to read is that is the only hill I will die on.
Yeah, choice is very important.
Choice, and our kids have no choice.
They have so little
No
choice in their
choice, like
day.
I can look at their schedule, I know exactly where they are every minute of the day,
What they're gonna eat.
what they're doing, and to like every minute.
Yeah,
One of the few places you get to exercise any choice is in the school library,
yeah.
in what books you choose to read, and that's so valuable. I think as adults, we forget that we have the privilege of making our own choices, and like, kids really don't have a ton of choice when they're in school.
So you use the term soft censorship,
Mm-hmm.
and I think, David, you use censorship. Is that the same as silent censorship? What is silent censorship?
I haven't heard of
I haven't
silent
heard-
censorship, but I'm wondering if it's kind of that same, like, I'm not overtly saying I'm not buying this book. I'm going to have it, but it's gonna stay on the shelf. I'm not putting it on the display. Or I'm gonna have it, but it's gonna be in the back office. And if someone wants to come and ask me for it, I'll get it for them. But I'm just not going to broadcast that I have this. And that is, that is really dangerous and that is really permeating even within our, our state where we do have, for the most part, robust policies and things in place to protect librarians.
And I've been asked, for instance, is there a book? Is there a book that goes so far that you would ban, or you would not allow? That you would not, as a political person, is there a book you would name that should not be in the school? And they brought up Mein Kampf, or you could bring up any number of books. And I said, the problem is not so much that I agree with a particular book. I may despise a book and the path that it leads to in terms of how one thinks. But where do you draw the line and who gets to draw the line? And therefore, you sort of have to draw a conclusion that a book banning of a book, you just can't really support. You can then say, here's all the reasons I think this book is important. Here's all the lessons we can learn from this book so that our society doesn't have this path. Or that people don't treat people a certain way. But it goes back to, once you start saying a book, who decides what majority rule goes beyond the constitutional right and critical thinking? And that's, I guarantee you, as a political leader, that's a hard thing to say, because you're like, oh, that person then supports blah, 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 blah. And the other part of it is, of course, there are court decisions around freedom of speech, what you can, and there are things you cannot say in certain places. We're defining the word pornography, as no redeeming value. I can't remember what the language is, but there's a specific definition, which is why genderqueer is not pornography,
Right.
whereas sexually explicit videos, that is just sexually explicit videos, is pornography. But that's been a hard.
I think when you talk to about like, where do you draw the line, that there is a line that we do draw, and it is,
Appropriate.
sure, there's always going to be that, and that is such a hard, like, even just that term is so hard to like.
Yeah, like
nail
age
down.
relevant, because age
Right.
is
Yeah, but there is like, it's not a one for one, it's not, I'm going to have a book about this, then therefore I need to have this to
That's
counterbalance.
like the media
that.
where they get 50-50 air.
Right, because I'm not going to have a book about climate change and then a book about climate denial, because that is not factual.
Right.
And I'm not going to have a book about the Holocaust and then a book about the Holocaust didn't happen, like that causes harm, that is where I draw the line.
Mhm.
And especially, I know we wanted to get into nonfiction, that when we hold up nonfiction as this like, it's truth, it's fact, which it is, we have to be so careful. We have to be so careful when we're weeding our collections, when we're getting rid of things. And, determining what is no longer relevant and what information has changed. And also just what information is accurate. And that's where we can fall on our policy and we can come back and say, this eliminates these people from conversation. I have books buying about LGBTQ characters. I'm not going to have a book that talks about, transphobia, or that, says that like this is, causing harm to children or whatever, just to have a balance, just to have both perspectives out there when one is alienating an entire group of people and causing harm and stripping away their humanity.
Yeah.
We won't do that. That is where we draw the line.
And with nonfiction, my sister's grandfather, for example, with her dad's, wrote US history textbooks, but this was back sort of in the 50s. And they were primarily sort of white men were history, right? Most of the people in this room didn't seem to exist much in history, except as a little side footnote or a spouse or something. And we were having this discussion as well, sort of, well, many of the great mathematicians from Middle East and Northeast Africa did not look like me. And, great pilots that were women, and sort of so today's, what we understand to be fact, also we learn and adjust with time. Because what was taught as fact then, as far as global history and US history in, in the 50s, we now know so much more. Or maybe it was known, but it was censored in a different way by the book authors and by the book printers. So the fact material does actually change over time, but some of the people that are in these rooms learned a different history.
Right.
So it's also informative to say, actually, what you learned was what was taught as the truth of the time, but also the earth was considered flat at one time. How we defined the word witch and what happened to define what does witch really mean, was understood very differently, and is now understood for the demeaning and devaluing of a whole group of women. So there's things we learn as we move forward in time.
Yeah, isn't it Maya Angelou who says like, when you know better, you can do better?
Oh, there you go.
When you know better, you can do better. And when you were talking about history books, it was making me think too, as librarians, we also work really hard. When we're looking at our collections, we talk about weeding collections and adding to collections. Collections are like gardens, right? Like you have to keep them healthy. And we also see gaps in our collections. Like we are trying to include more books now that are like amplifying historically marginalized voices, and like trying to make sure that when our children are learning westward expansion, they're not like manifest destiny, no one was here, let's go. Like that's shifted over time, and we're seeing resources get published that are more inclusive of everyone who was part of history, and not just the white men who were able to override with their status and their money,
Right.
to have their names put into history books too.
And those that were here, were also imperfect. I mean, we do right now have a bit of an idolization of indigenous populations, but there were different cultures and they had different battles over natural resources, and there were wars, and there were a number of things that were not idyllic, and there were other aspects of the ways that they thought about land and resources that was far more distant thinking than maybe how we use things today. And these are continuing conversations, I think, as well.
I wonder if anybody who's joined us through Zoom has a question before we finish up.
There was a woman on earlier, I don't know if she's gone.
Or not?
She's still on.
Oh.
She's still on.
Well, we'll take-
But she just turned her camera
I have
Yeah.
a question.
Sure.
To the librarians, are there certain books that you consider classic standards that have to be in a collection?
I think classic has shifted over time for us, like, I know a lot of people think of classics as like the Scarlet Letter, the Adventures of Tom, To Kill a Mockingbird, you know, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah,
But also like what was classic at one point has shifted, like we're also the value we place on different stories, and like luckily, we work with kids, middle grade fiction has exploded in the last 30 years, like my kids have so many more choices, and I think I've been in, middle school library for 11 years now, we really don't say, well, that's a classic, so we have to keep it.
Right.
And often when we're teaching, and again, our kids only go up to 8th grade, but we're talking about like classics, you can teach a classic paired with something more modern to give kids context about how that book is translated through time, and also what is the purpose of teaching that classic text. Like I remember having to read The Old Man and the Sea,
yeah.
like was I being punished? And I'm someone who's always loved reading, but I was given that book because it was a classic and we were reading it as a class. And I remember thinking, I can battle my way through this because I'm an advanced reader. I think about my classmates who hate reading, being given a book because it's a classic, who are just being confronted with like, reading sucks, this is boring, I hate this, it has no relevance to my life. And I think we've seen this awesome shift in education to using texts and materials that would really suck our kids in and want to engage more. So I think there has been a big shift away from the traditional, a classic novel. And also depending on the age you serve, like a public library probably has more options than my school library, because I also don't have so much space.
Right,
Like
we're
space
libraries,
that-
not archives.
And yeah, that's something we always yell is we have to throw things away, like, we're not archives, we have to get rid of stuff because we don't have enough real estate.
But you have, for instance, Anne Frank, which is, not a new book.
Oh, no,
It's not a 300-year-old book, because history is more than that. But is that a book that you think will remain a classic, or will it age out of existence?
I don't know, I mean, it could age out, I think as we see less and less kids understanding and knowing about what the Holocaust was, I think we could see this stuff phase out, but
I mean, it could be a book written by a young person in Gaza.
That's
Yeah.
what's important about books like that, though, like Huck Finn and Frank, that they tell a story that's timeless.
time.
And can be applied to any period of time and situation. And there's not really that many books that fit that category. And then, to me, some of those books get attacked because they're locked in the period they were written in. Dr. Seuss comes to mind. Like Dr. Seuss to me was a good book for getting kids into reading. With the lines, it's funny. And the fact that when he was writing, you looked at Japs a certain way, you looked at Chinese a certain way in America in the 30s. Does that mean that you don't show Dr. Seuss? You don't let the kids read?
Right, that's an
Reading
interesting
eggs
point.
in hand?
Because Dr. Seuss's estate are the people who chose to stop publishing those books. Because they realized that 60 years have passed since these books were written, we recognize now that these are harming other people. Dr. Seuss's catalog is massive. They don't have to keep publishing books that do damage, because Green Eggs and Ham, I have that in my library, the Lorax. Like, there are plenty of great books, but I think people think like Dr. Seuss is being targeted. His estate made the decision that we do not want to perpetuate this stereotyping in these books. So we're
We
just
want his
gonna,
legacy
and I
to be
think it was like
something.
10 books, nine, something like that, that they were like, these are just no longer in print. And it wasn't like, bring them all in, let's burn them. It was like, no, they're just no longer in
Or
print.
add them to the next one.
Yeah, we don't need to, because also the world is full of so many great choices right now. But I think, yeah, it doesn't we don't have to vilify people, but when you know better, you can do better.
And some books like Anne Frank, I would imagine there are people who don't look like Anne Frank who can still see themselves in that character or in that othering, which leads to being able to be annihilated just by being an other. Because we have other examples of that for people of different races or, circumstances that may be more contemporary or may have happened also 200 years ago as opposed to 80 years ago, or maybe happening now. So it's interesting to think about how a book will age or not, if it does reflect sort of an unfortunate timeless aspect of human action.
What other books did you bring to? I know we're out of time, but
Yeah.
do you want to say anything about them before we?
I would love to just say a quick thing about Speak, that is Lori Hall Sanderson, and I chose this one because she has one of the most powerful quotes about censorship that I just think just can sort of bring it all back, where she says, "Censorship is the child of fear and the father of ignorance." When we just think about this whole idea, as a concept that removing books, that taking away and silencing ideas comes from fear, comes from the unknown, which we can explore and we can learn about through just putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes and learning about their story. And it produces ignorance. The children who will walk away from our schools, not having been exposed to these stories, will walk away more ignorant, will walk away, not knowing many things. It's a wonderful book, but I love that book so much from her.
And she also wrote an excellent article called Step Between Rage and Compassion, which is about like finding out that your books have been banned and like why people like, and books are labors of love. And I think people forget that like someone poured their life force into this book to get it on the shelf. And I think as an author, someone asked Alex Gino, who wrote Melissa, formerly titled George, like, how does it feel to be the #1, like, very rock and roll, how cool? And Alex was like, I'm heartbroken, like, this is not cool, it's not fun, it's the fact that we're still fighting censorship in 2024 is really dismal and like problematic, but we're also raising like our students to know what their rights are, know that they have a voice and how to use their powers for good and how to create tidal change, where hopefully this will become a passing fad again, because I have more on my plate. I teach a full schedule, like
We really need to be doing that.
Looks like we have kids that we have to teach. So I hope we're seeing a shift sooner rather than later, where people can choose for themselves, because that's the whole thing. Think for yourself and let other people do the same.
And I want to thank you, I really appreciate all of you for taking the time to be here with us.
Thanks for having us. It's an important conversation.
Thank you.